Well, hello again. Now, I was asked to show a video of how to go about checking the coils in a Philco 70, and I must warn you ahead of time. I'm going to run through this fairly quickly because this is I'm going to throw a lot of information at you rather quickly because in the sense of I posted a video earlier or tried to attempt to post one earlier, and it was too large to be able to do so. So I'm going to run through this, as I said, rather expediently. By all means, feel free to ask questions at the end because I'm sure you probably will. Now, here is the basic circuit of a Philco 70. Now, this is the early variant, there are two different variants. But the basic precept of checking coils is going to be the same for either of the sets, but there are some specifics I'm going to touch on with the locations of this set that are only, for the most part, viable to that particular variant. Okay, we're going to be doing strictly ohms checks. Sets turned off, unplugged. We're strictly checking for ohms and for resistance. So let's get started. Now, the coils we're concerning ourselves with here, you're going to see are coils number 2, number 6, 19, 22, and number 8. Now, I wish to run down real briefly on where these coils are located. It makes them much easier to troubleshoot. Coil number 2 is underneath the cover, that metal tube shield at the front of the set. Coil number 6 is underneath the middle of that tube shield. Coil number 19 is at the rear corner of the chassis, not underneath the shield, but the rear corner. Coil number 2 is on the rear of the chassis toward the middle, on the very back of the chassis. And coil number 8 is underneath the cover, the tube shield, at the most rearward tube. So keep that in mind. You might want to make notes of that because that's going to be very imperative to troubleshoot any further. What we'll start with here today is we're going to look at coil number 2 first off, and we're going to check each of these coils, primary and secondary, independently as we go along. Now, coil number 2, let's go ahead and get a closer look at it, shall we? Coil number 2, you're going to notice that it connects from your antenna post through your volume pot, through your primary of your coil to chassis ground. Very easy to check. Put your meter to ohms, one lead to your antenna post, one lead to anywhere in the chassis. This inverted triangle, this dashed inverted triangle, denotes chassis ground. So 1 meter lead to your antenna post, one to anywhere in the chassis. You should have a resistance reading. Now it's going to vary depending upon the position of your volume pot. This is an early variant of volume control where they actually had the control on the front end of the set. You should have continuity from antenna to ground, once again, varied by position of your volume control. If in fact you're open between antenna and ground, more than likely you have a bad primary of coil number 2. Let's move forward to the secondary of coil number 2. The secondary of coil number 2, if you notice, it comes off a tube connection you see here. Comes here through the secondary to a common ground plane, and it goes to chassis ground. Now you're going to ask, what is this connection inside the tube here? That is your control grid on your 24 tube. Now you're going to ask me, what is your control grid? That on a 24 tube, your control grid is that silver cap on top of your tube. Very easy access. That's why I like working sets with 24s. The control grid is right on top. It's truly beneficial for troubleshooting, and I guess we'll get into that maybe later in another video, but it's really convenient. But so you're going to go from the grid cap, this is the most forward tube under the cover, to chassis ground. If you have an open between this control grid and chassis ground, more than likely you have an open secondary of coil number 2. Now let's move forward to down the line. We're going to take a look at the primary of coil number 6. Now we're actually going to check all these, if I may, and with relative ease, kind of all at one time, and it's really handy. Notice this coil you see here comes up to your plate of your 24. So we're going to start at the plate of your 24 through this coil. It comes across this wire and it comes to a dot. That's a connection point. They're connected together. Comes up to this coil to this plate. We're going to continue on further to another dot. There's a connection. Comes up to this plate. So all three of these plates are connected together. The easiest way to identify the plate of a tube, what you have to do is go to your tube manual, and I've made a little diagram here just for clarity. On a tube 24, for pin locations, and they're always viewed in your tube manual from the bottom of the set, looking straight down at your pins. For reference, we're going to put the two large pins at the bottom. The two large pins are your filament pins. The most leftward pin of the two large pins is always pin number 1. So we're going to count clockwise: 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 pins, 5 being the other respective pin for your filament. Notice there is a little square annotation off the side here that annotates your top grid cap, and that's for your control grid. More specifically, filament, 2 is your plate, 3 is your screen grid, 4 is your cathode, and 5 once again is your filament. So those are going to come in handy to know the locations of these what connects to where within the tube. Won't get into what they do specifically in a tube, that's for another video. But once again, we're going to check from our plate. So we're going to go to pin 2 from the underside of the chassis. When we go to pin 2 from underside the chassis, we're going to measure from pin 2 of this 24 to pin 2 of this 24. And we should have continuity through this leg of the circuit. And we also should come over to here to pin 2 of this 24 and have continuity to this complete leg, all 3 legs of the circuit. So from pin 2 to pin 2 to pin 2, we have continuity. And this is what's called your B plus side, your high voltage side of your tube. Your plate is your high voltage within the tube. Very easy to check. Pin 2, pin 2, pin 2, and you have continuity. Next, I'd like to move forward onto the secondaries and also as well as this oscillator coil, if I may. Now, this here is we're going to come from the control grid of this 24. It comes through the secondary. We've already checked this primary. Remember, we were 2, 2, and 2 through the primaries. Now, this is the secondary side. We come off the control grid, which is once again, the top cap on a 24, through this secondary, through part of the oscillator coil, and looky there, it goes to chassis ground. How convenient. Because now we could put our meter lead to this top of this 24 tube, to chassis ground, and we should have continuity. If we don't, more than likely one of these coils is open. Next, I'd like to move on to the secondary of this coil, if I may. The second of this coil, once again, we come off of a control grid, but notice we're on a 27 tube now for the oscillator. The control grid, the 27, does not have a grid cap on top, so one must go underneath the tube to get to the control grid. And that's where this diagram comes into play. Once again, we look at our tube manual, we see that 2 big pins referencing the filament at the very bottom. 1 to the left is always our number 1 pin. 2 is our plate, 3 is our grid, 4 is our cathode. So there's our grid. It's pin number 3 on a 27. So we're going to come to this 27, pin number 3, across here. We're going to put our meter lead on pin number 3. We're going to read across here, all the way across here, to this capacitor number 15. And you're going to say, where's this capacitor 15? Philco is so good about giving a pictorial layout on the bottom of the chassis. We look for numerical number 15. We find it here. We follow it up to a little small mica capacitor located right there. So We're going to go from pin 3 to our little mica cap here, and once again we should have continuity through these coils. All that's left are 2 more secondaries, and that we're going to do here. This is for coil number 19 secondary. We are going to go from the control grid of this respective 24 tube. It's at the rear corner of the chassis. Go through this coil, and look at there. Once again, the chassis ground makes it so easy. Top of the cap of the grid cap of your 24, chassis ground, should have continuity. If you do not, then that particular coil is open. And lastly, one last coil is going to be the secondary of coil number 22. Once again, this is the coil located on the middle of the rear of the chassis. We're going to come from the top of the control grid of this 24. Once again, the grid cap on top makes it so sweet. That's why I love troubleshooting sets with 24s. I mean, they're so easy. Because the grid is a very good troubleshooting location, and we'll get into that maybe in a later video. So we're going to come off of that control grid at the middle of the rear of the chassis, through here. Once again, look, it goes to chassis ground as well. So there's an easy way of checking all your coils. I realize I ran through it rather quickly. I'm sure you're going to have to probably read it or listen to it or watch it a couple, 2-3 times to take it all in. I know I covered a lot of information. But by all means, feel free to ask questions, and I'll be glad to answer them to the best of my ability. As always, I do appreciate you watching, and until next time.